Now that I've finished Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, I thought I'd give my thoughts on the game as a whole. As a brief summary of my opinions on this game, I love the story, characters, and art style, but the actual gameplay didn't quite engage me the way that earlier games in the series have. And I feel like the perfect step forward for the series would be to carry on Echoes' approach to story while combining it with Conquest's gameplay. So now the long version. Echoes is a remake of the second game in the series, Fire Emblem Gaiden, which was actually the only Fire Emblem apart from the first one that I hadn't played before. I do know quite a bit about Gaiden though. I've seen footage of it, I've listened to its OST a lot, and I have read fan translations of its script. I've also read quite a few walkthroughs of it back in the day, so I have a pretty good idea as to what was kept and what was changed in the remake. As a remake, Echoes is, in a way, the exact opposite of Shadow Dragon's approach to being a remake. Shadow Dragon modernized the gameplay of the original Fire Emblem 1, which was very much needed, to the standards of the later games in the series, by adding things like weapon ranks, the weapon triangle, pretty much everything you'd expect from a modern Fire Emblem. But it also left the original game's bare-bones story and non-existent character development in. Echoes, on the other hand, goes really all out with modernizing the original game's story, even adding the support system from later games, which I really wish they did with Shadow Dragon. But on the other hand, Echoes leaves its gameplay barely touched from the original game, which in some ways feels a little bit strange, since Fire Emblem Gaiden was indicative of a trend typical of a lot of Nintendo franchises, in that the second game in the series was very, very weird by the standards of later ones, and introduced a lot of mechanics that generally didn't really stick. Now, I'm not saying that everything that Echoes left in was bad. There's a lot about Echoes' gameplay that I think is actually much better than many other games in the series. So I guess I'll quickly go over the gameplay elements that I really enjoyed. Gaiden started the world map system, which was originally forgotten but made a resurgence in Sacred Stones and has now become standard for the series. I did enjoy this game's world map quite a lot. It was fun hopping between locations, and Valentia is a very interesting world with the different paths the characters took throughout the story. I did quite enjoy them. Progression between areas felt natural, and despite the major lack of bosses with any plot significance, every map felt like you were meaningfully advancing the game. Another thing that I love about this one, the dungeons. Those were really, really fun. Gaiden added a lot of traditional RPG elements to the series, most of which disappeared afterwards, but bringing back the dungeons was surprisingly more fun than I thought it would be, and the way they turned them into actual 3D roaming dungeons, even though the encounters with enemies within these dungeons were fairly basic, it was really fun exploring. I did really enjoy it. Something cool that I like the remake adding is that if you return to dungeons after you've already completed them, stronger enemies can sometimes appear, and these enemies have higher drop rates than normal, which alleviates one of the issues of the original game. They're still pretty low though. I also enjoyed the application of the fatigue mechanic in these dungeons. Thankfully, it's nowhere near as harsh as FE5's fatigue, which forced a character to sit out the next chapter entirely, but it did give a good incentive to both hoard food items and also avoid grinding too much, because halved HP is a really big deal, while also not being quite as debilitating as forcing the character out of the battle completely. Outside of exploration, here's a few other things that I loved about the gameplay. I love how archers work in this game. This is, to me, the only Fire Emblem to truly get archers right. Fates did buff archers quite a bit from their sand status as one of the worst classes in the series, but it did so simply by turning archers into complete nukes with ridiculous might on their weapons. It was a good try, but while it made archers better, it didn't really make them better in a way that made them feel like archers, if you get what I mean. This is the one Fire Emblem where I used archers the way that you're meant to use archers in a medieval battlefield. That is, providing support fire for your other units, firing volleys of arrows into enemies in cover, and sniping weakened enemies from far distances. Finally, snipers can truly live up to their name. Letting them counterattack at one range and giving them increased range with their bows all the way up to 5 spaces sometimes, like I said, it really makes archers feel the way they should, as a long-range class that sits behind lines and picks off other enemies from a distance. But they didn't feel broken to me either, because they're balanced out by having fairly bad stats across the board, relatively weak might on their weapons, and often fairly low accuracy. The low accuracy also gave you a lot of incentive to use the archer's special skills. I'll get into the skill system later. The main thing that I really like about this game though, the magic system. I thought I'd hate this at first. When I first learned that you had to use HP to cast spells in the original game, and that it was being kept for the remake, I was very skeptical. But honestly, I really enjoyed this. Having characters learn spells by level up like a traditional RPG, it helped make all the mages feel distinct from each other. You might get lots of different mages, but some of them learn different spells. The HP cost for magic usually wasn't that much of a problem since healing mages was relatively easy, and thankfully they only ever used their cheapest HP cost spells to counterattack. It would have been pretty bad if they could have been forced into, let's say, using Aura to counter, and completely wrecking their own speed as well as destroying their own HP bar. Another thing I loved about the magic system is the addition of 1 to 3 range magic. It was balanced out by either really high HP costs, weight, or low accuracy, but having access to increased range on your spellcasters, I found was just such a useful thing to have, and it really made all the different spells feel distinct. There's a spell for every situation, and that was really cool. Though speaking of spells, I will say, 2 spells that I didn't like very much were Aura and Ragnarok. Aura because the thing about Aura is, it's powerful, but it gives your speed massively, and almost everyone who learns it gets Seraphim, and since you're mainly fighting Terrors, Seraphim tends to do more damage anyway, and it has a better chance of doubling too. Ragnarok, well, I felt like Ragnarok was really overkill more than anything. Against non-magic resistant enemies, all other spells will just kill the enemy anyway, so you don't need to use it. Really, I felt the only use for Ragnarok was against Dread Fighters, because the sheer amount of might is necessary to get around their magic resistance. Magic ignoring terrain was also really cool. I really like that and kind of wish that happens going forward into the series, because it gives magic users a unique niche of taking out enemies that are in terrain. Especially given the increased terrain bonuses in this one, which oddly enough I actually like, with one main exception that I'll be getting to later, but I like the very high evade bonuses that Graves and Woods gave. It give you a really good incentive to actually use magic to take out enemies in these areas. So now that I got that out of the way, let's talk about mechanics from the original that I'm not a particularly big fan of. And let me get this out of the way, Cantors are not one of them. I didn't actually have that much of a problem with Cantors personally. With one exception, the one in Greece Citadel that summons freaking Bone Walkers in such a tight, narrow corridor when you've got a really tough boss to worry about in the first place. I did not like that guy at all. But almost every other Cantor in the game was fine. I never really had much of an issue with them. Things I do have an issue with though. Here is the biggest gripe that I have about the terrain mechanic in this game. The tile terrain type. I really don't like this at all. Basically, it means that whenever you're indoors, everyone on the battlefield gets plus 20 evasion. Which, it does nothing more than add extra luck to the game. Now, in some cases, I actually did like it, like in the end map of Act 1, Desay's Castle. You had those archers that were on top of the turrets, and I felt that they deserved to have an evade bonus, because if you're an archer shooting up at them from below, which is what I was doing with Python, naturally you'd have worse accuracy than them shooting down on you from above. It's kind of like Radiant Dawn's height mechanic, which I really wish would come back in the series, by the way, because it was great. But in maps where you're all indoors, giving everyone a plus 20 evade bonus is just... it accomplishes nothing beyond making the game more frustrating. I'm still not a big fan of the one equipment slot system. The fact that almost every class can only use one weapon type means there's often not that much variety between the different classes, and it turns most classes into a one-trick pony. It also means that you can't effectively carry healing items without getting rid of your weapon or shield slot. I do kinda get why they did this, especially since combining certain weapons and certain shields would actually be pretty broken. But to me, one thing I like about Fire Emblem is being able to carry multiple weapons on a character for different situations. Like, for example, a heavy armor-slaying weapon for anti-armor work, but one that you don't really want to use against regular enemies because it gimps your speed. Here, you're pretty much forced into having each character only perform one role, which, given that you can deploy so many characters at once, is not that bad, but I don't know, I'm just not really that big of a fan of it personally. Speaking of classes and variety, something that I'm also not a big fan of, the way that promotion bonuses work in this game. Now, in some ways it's actually pretty good. The way they work is that when you promote, your stats are raised up to your new class's base stats if they were lower. If not, they're unchanged. The good part of it is, it's an insurance against RNG screwage, which did happen to me for a few characters, but I was like, you know, I'm not too worried, because once I promote, I'll be catching up in these stats anyway. The thing that I don't like about this promotion bonus system, though, is that it means there's very little variety between members of the same class. So for example, on Celica's route, I was using both Saber and Kamui, and both of them fulfilled subtly different roles. Saber had better defense, while Kamui had better attack. Except that when they both promoted to Dreadfighter, suddenly their stats were the exact same again, and I'm thinking like, what's the point to me using both of these characters again? Really, one of the main draws of Fire Emblem to me is that everyone in your army is an individual. You use characters, not faceless units like Advance Wars, and having everyone just become exactly the same, stat-wise, as members of their same class on promotion, it kind of ruins a bit of that uniqueness and personality to me. Sure, they will eventually grow apart as they level up, but especially with classes with multiple tiers of promotion, they then even out again. And this wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that you get a lot of people of the same class depending on what route you're on. Alm gets way too many Cavaliers, and Celica gets way too many Mercenaries. So you start getting to the point where you're like, do I really need 5 Dreadfighters or 5 Gold Knights? Because of that one weapon system, it's like, they're really all just, in the case of Gold Knights, mounted lance users that move really far. They all fulfill very similar roles unless you equip each of them with very different specialized weapons, so I'm not really sure about that lack of variety, personally. And yeah, this also wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that you actually can deploy your entire army outside of dungeons, so there's incentive for characters of the same class to be different, but they're sort of not. Other gameplay aspects of the original that I'm not too keen on, the complete lack of resistance growths. Now, I get that they wanted to make magic really useful. The problem is that there's really only one class that's good at countering mages once you get later in the game, because everyone has virtually non-existent resistance growths, even the Pegasus Knights. I really wish at the very least the Pegasus Knights would have had something vaguely resembling a resistance growth, because that's really what they're supposed to do. Sure, Dreadfighters are great at being dedicated mage counters, but here's the thing. Dreadfighters are a little too good in my opinion. I feel like the class balance in this game is mostly okay, except for Dreadfighters. Did they seriously need to give Dreadfighters 7 movement? When I first saw Grief, I was like, really? 7? 7 movements on a foot unit? In a game where a lot of classes don't even go past 4, really? And it's on a class with great skill and speed, great offense, and half damage from magic. And the ability to loop back to Villager and gain even more level up, something that no other class can do, making them really the only ones viable for the post-game dungeon. Speaking of movement, was it really necessary to give promoted mages only 4 movement? I get it, magic is powerful and has more range than it used to, but I felt that my mages really fell behind in the endgame because maps are surprisingly large in Echoes, and having 4 movement is a really big detriment. I get that's kind of the thing with barons, but really? Sages and priestesses? And in particular, this annoyed me most with Celica. Early on in the game, Celica was great for me, but once I passed the halfway point, and once I started getting into Act 4 especially, Celica started to drop off in usefulness for me, and I was having a hard time figuring out why. Her stats were good, she had good spells, why wasn't I using her more? And then it hit me. 4 movements. That alone made Celica drop off in usefulness so much in the endgame. She just couldn't get to where she was needed. That combined with the fact that Alm had like 6 movement on promotion, it felt very unfair to me. I feel like mages wouldn't have been broken even if they'd been given better movement, so why did they stick them with 4? I mean, there's no other game in the series where mages are as slow as armor knights in terms of map movement. Then there are witches. Witches are a pretty weird enemy class. Normally the ability to warp anywhere on the map and still move and attack afterwards is just absolutely horrifying in a Fire Emblem game. But the weird thing is, they're actually not as much of a threat as they should be because their AI is incredibly inconsistent and stupid. Often, they'll warp and attack someone who they barely do any damage to, and who will kill them in return. Other times, they'll just not warp when you have severely weakened characters on the field. I'm glad for this, sure, because if witches actually had good AI, a lot of maps would be virtually unbeatable without deaths. But it does feel very, very strange that there's an enemy type in a Fire Emblem game that's only bearable because their AI is terrible. I suppose the biggest gripe that I have with the gameplay, though, is the map design. Just something about it just didn't grab me the way earlier games in the series did. Recently I've been replaying Sacred Stones to get in the mood for the playthrough that I plan on doing, and it really struck me how much more fun I was having with the Sacred Stones maps than I was with the maps in Echoes. A lot of Alm's maps are just big, wide open plains, and Celica has, while she does have some better ones, I quite like the fort full of archers, and as evil of a level as it is, I did like Grief Citadel as well. Those were some of the few memorable maps to me though. And Celica also had to contend with desert that mages still get slowed down by. I don't see why they did that either. One other thing though that I didn't like so much about these maps is, there's not very much variety in enemies. Like I said, there was that all-archer map with Celica. Alm has tons of all-cavalier maps. Usually most of the enemies are just a single class. Now I think about it, I don't think you ever see enemy Pegasus Knights either. And while some of these all-one-class maps can be kind of fun, like the Archer one that I mentioned, most of them are just fairly boring overall. Because of this, I actually felt myself starting to lose a lot of interest in the game later on, but the story did keep me going. As far as other things kept from the original go, I'm pretty sure this game does not use true hit, and I'm not a big fan of that. Since Fates didn't have true hit either, I feel like the series is starting to move away from that, which personally I really don't like at all. For those who don't know what true hit is, basically every Fire Emblem from 6 until 13 had a mechanic where, to calculate whether an attack hits or misses, it rolled 2 random numbers and took the average, and then compared that to the hit rate. What this meant was that hit rates with higher chances were skewed towards hitting more often, and low hit chances were skewed towards missing more often. Like in earlier games, you could feel pretty confident if an enemy had only a 30% chance of hitting you. That would almost never hit you. Whereas a hit rate of above 70 was generally guaranteed to hit. Without true hits, low hit rates are much more likely to screw you over, and to me it makes the game far more luck dependent. Low percent criticals also happen more often as well, and one thing that I've noticed is, I suspect that the AI actually cheats with them. Hear me out. So, in one of my runs of Greece Citadel, I had Valbar at one point of the map luring a mercenary down on the lower parts. A witch warped next to him and attacked him and brought him down to reasonably low health. The mercenary then attacked, got a 2% critical, and killed him. I rewound with Miller's turn wheel, and this time the mercenary didn't crit Valbar. But here's the weird thing. The witch didn't warp this time. It didn't attack Valbar at all. Which leads me to conclude that the AI must have known that that mercenary was going to get a 2% crit, because why else would it have the witch attack him and put him in kill range of a crit otherwise? This is definitely not okay to me. There's also the combat arts mechanic. I'm a bit hit and miss on this mechanic. There were some combat arts that I found quite useful, but others, I just did not find myself needing to use them very much. The main ones that I used were the ones that added accuracy, because it helped combat enemies in terrain. Letting, for example, my Pegasus Knights reliably hit enemy cantors on tiles, or my archers to have nearly 100% accuracy with their picking off weakened enemies. But I didn't like how you had to keep the weapon equipped just to keep the skills attached to it. I wish that it was more like, say, this is going to be a weird comparison, but Tokyo Mirage sessions, where you learn skills off of a weapon, and once you've mastered it, you can move on to a different weapon to keep the skills that you've learned. That might be a little overpowered in the case of some of the skills in this game, but it just feels a bit weird. Like, if I've got, let's say I've got a Steel Lance, I've maxed it out and learned the Steel Lance's skills. Later on, we're fighting a lot of knights, and I wanted to use a Rider's Bane. But if I use the Rider's Bane, I'll lose all the skills that I got. And then later in the game, I find a Silver Lance. I really want to try out the Silver Lance, but I have to give up all of my Steel Lance skills to use it. It's kind of a shame that it works that way. Also, while a lot of the skills are mostly just a couple of might increases or accuracy boosts, a lot of them don't allow you to double, which actually makes them not that useful, but the ones that do forcibly make you double are kind of ridiculous. Arm's Twin Lions, I feel, is incredibly broken. It's 2 attacks with a Brave Weapon effect, so the enemy doesn't get to hit you in between them, and it's got such high of a might and critical boost that in general the enemy just dies and Arm isn't scratched at all. It's kind of a shame that his ultimate weapon doesn't even have that attached to it, but yes, that to me was one of the most broken skills in the game. As far as another somewhat nitpick I have when it comes to gameplay, I'm not really sure why they changed Jetta's weakness from every 4 turns to every 4th character who attacks him per turn. For one, it's basically a giant middle finger to players who played the original, because they'll try what worked in the original and realize that it doesn't now. But also, it's kind of a middle finger to people who didn't play the original either, because from what I've heard, a lot of people mistake Jetta for being outright unbeatable. Which, in his first appearance in the Swamps of Dooma, isn't really that inaccurate, because you're not really meant to beat him there, it's kind of like Desai earlier. But in his final chapter appearance, that chapter gets infinitely harder if you don't know how to kill him, and many people have thought that it was literally impossible to do so. The only hint you get towards it is that one villager in the Sage's Hamlet, and it is very cryptic as to what it actually implies. I feel like the original's him being vulnerable every 4 turns, it would have made him a lot easier, but I feel like it was more intuitive to that hint than the new system is. It would also help if the description of his Dooma's gift skill didn't say, makes the user invincible, because that definitely gives players the wrong idea. On another related note, I did have an issue with how Celica's point of no return was handled as well. Now, I knew there'd be a point of no return at the end of Dooma's tower. It was like that in the original, and I expected it to still be like that. And the story does very heavily hint that things are going to be like that once you reach the top of the tower. The problem that I had was, there was no indication as to which floor of the Tower of Dooma was the last one, and that once you did reach the last floor, you were immediately locked out of the world map, and there was nothing you could do about it. On Alm's route, they warn you about his point of no return. They specifically replay a line of dialogue that says, once you enter Dooma's temple, there is no going back. I don't see why they couldn't do the same thing for Celica. Because this is what ended up happening when I played. I was like, okay, I know that once we get to the end of Dooma's tower, Celica's going to agree to sacrifice herself and will never be able to access her party until the final battle. So, what I planned to do was to go through the whole tower for the experience first, because I had characters who were almost ready to promote but not quite. Then I wanted to get to almost the end, then get out and promote everyone at the nearest Mila shrine before coming back. The problem was, due to there being no indication of which floor of Dooma's tower is the end, I ended up advancing to the end, getting to that semi-village screen with Jeddah on it, and realizing there was no back button. This meant that I didn't get a chance to promote Sonya before the final battle, so I couldn't bring her, and for those who know Sonya's backstory, that was very frustrating to me. This is a really big issue, because the final chapter is probably harder than everything else in the game combined, and if you go into Celica's point of no return early, a vast majority of her party is going to be useless there. Personally, I wish that her point of no return was talking to Jeddah, rather than actually reaching Jeddah and just them taking away your back button. And now I guess I'll talk about the final chapter. Oh boy, the final chapter. I do actually like the final chapter in a lot of ways, but it is much, much harder than anything that's been in the game beforehand. Like I said, I think the final chapter of this game is harder than everything else in the game combined. Namely, there are some pretty vicious enemies like Jeddah and Dooma himself, as well as the fact that you've got a lot of enemy summoners, meaning that you're encouraged to rush and kill them quickly, otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed. Now, the witches are no issue whatsoever, because, yeah, their AI is fairly stupid, and by that point, they're really not a threat to anyone you should be bringing to the final chapter. Basically, if anyone is going to get one-rounded by a witch, you shouldn't have brought them to the final chapter to begin with. The issue, though, is the Moguls. I now finally see where Tearing Saga got its inspiration for its frustratingly difficult Moguls from. The Moguls in this game are not their pathetic cousins from Sacred Stones. They have so much speed that they're really surprisingly durable, since very few people can double them effectively. And when they can divide, thankfully they divide very rarely. It's not like the ones in Tearing Saga, which, oh boy, yeah. But the fact that both Jeddah and Dooma can spawn as many as even more than 4 per turn, if you take too long, you can easily get completely swamped by them, and that can be pretty hard to recover from. Compounding this is the fact that both Jeddah and Dooma are actually extremely strong. Dooma is, in my opinion, one of the few Fire Emblem final bosses who's not a total joke. He has an enormous amount of HP. Unlike some final bosses, his question mark HP actually doesn't matter. It felt like it took forever for him to get into visible digits. But there's also the fact that he moves and has 1 to 5 range on his attacks. Also, frustratingly enough, despite the fact that he never had higher than a 50% hit rate on me, I only saw him miss once. Once in the about 20 times that he attacked me. Yeah, my luck is pretty abysmal. He actually crit something once too, but thankfully it was an illusion. Basically, I handled Dooma by gradually feeding him illusions every turn. The illusion spell's pretty useful in that regard, because enemies like to prioritize easy kills where they can, and it seems like they will always prioritize killing a phantom over killing one of your own units. So, basically, yeah, I just fed Dooma illusions every turn while the rest of us willed him down. Despite that, the final chapter was the one chapter in the game where I ended up using up my Mila's turn wheel allowance entirely. Though that was mostly to ensure that I got crits on Jeddah, because I didn't want to have to endure him for another few more turns. I suppose in general, This game could be seen as one of the few Fire Emblem games to fall into the TV trope, easy levels, hard bosses. Normally, Fire Emblem games are the exact opposite. It's generally pretty tough getting through the maps, but usually the bosses go down very, very easily. In this game, the bosses in general are probably the toughest part of the game. Most of them have some pretty decent stats, good equipment, and high movement or attack ranges, or both. I actually did kind of like that though. For once, the bosses actually felt climactic enough. So those are basically my general thoughts on the overall gameplay of this one. Join me next time where I discuss the story and characters.